Well, it is great to be here and excited to do this. And thank you, Armand, for putting the talk together. I think we're going to have fun together for the next hour. That's the goal, is to learn, but also to sort of have some fun together. So over the course of today's hour conversation, we'll attempt to do this. We'll try to define urban technology, explain really what we can achieve from it, and really sort through some of the challenges. So in my mind, I think we're thinking about this question of how will it influence quality of life? Why do we care? How do we measure success? And then how do we implement it? So most importantly, our esteemed panelists, which we'll introduce here in a second, will introduce how technology is really sort of shaping their fields. I think we've got an interesting group of panelists, both representing sort of community and development and arts, real estate development, and obviously technologists. So let me do this. Let's introduce and welcome our panelists. You have Google's very own Greg Nevill-Manning. Welcome. Greg is the CTO of Sidewalk Labs. As many of you probably know, Sidewalk Labs is an Alphabet subsidiary, applies people-centric to urban design, and really, frankly, is one of the talks of the really sort of one of those things that people like myself, urban real estate developers and urbanists, are really sort of thinking about in terms of technology and how it will have an impact really on our field and what that means for us going forward.
Yeah, I would jump in for those of you who are fairly new. If you don't know, Craig actually started the Google New York City campus.
Ooh, that's why you're all here. We also have Jonathan Rose. Jonathan is the CEO of the Rose Companies, which is a development company which finds new ways to improve communities, both environmentally, socially, and economically. Rose Companies has developed more than 100 projects across the United States. It is the 10th largest owner of affordable housing across the country. In addition, Jonathan is a recent author. Wrote a really terrific book, which I would recommend for all of you to take a look at. It's called The Well-Tempered City. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. So please take a look. So join me in welcoming Jonathan as well. We also have Elizabeth Goldstein, who's the president of the Municipal Art Society here in New York. The Art Society has helped New York advocate for thoughtful and inclusive urban design for almost 125 years, for over 125 years. And I will tell you that as we talk about the ideas of displacement and gentrification, a lot of the challenges that cities like New York is facing, the role of your organization and what the Municipal Art Society does is critically important. Prior to becoming the president of that organization, she was also the president of the California State Parks Foundation, and most importantly, has worked inside government for a really long time. So as we talk about this idea of implementing technology into government and getting government to sort of adopt this, you'll have some great insights for us as well. So please join me in also welcoming Elizabeth to the conversation.
So you heard everything Steven said, and he's going to run the show. But so many of you reached out saying you want to ask Craig and everybody questions. I will have a dory going. If you go ask the panel, I'll try to squeeze in a couple. No promises, but that's what I'll be doing over here. So if you want to take it from there.
Sure. So I think let's just start with an opening panel question for all of the panelists, and that is this. As we think about urban technology, how are you seeing technology factor into the long-term sort of vision and work of your organizations? And maybe just provide a really specific example for us. Elizabeth, we'll start with you.
Sure. I'd be delighted to do that. I mean, I think technology both has extraordinary ability to change and make our lives in cities much better, but it also poses some very significant public policy challenges. If you just think about the sharing technology and the controversy that's existed around Airbnb, for instance, and even some of the car share programs, to what extent the city should yield spaces that normal people park in to shared car services, for instance, is a question that wouldn't have been posed a number of decades ago. It just would never have come up, right? Because the technology drove the ability, forgive the pun, drove the ability to to engage in that way. And the sharing economy is obviously posing lots of challenges from a public policy perspective, both in a really strong and positive way, but also in some ways that are really challenging.
So Jonathan, what about the work that you do with your company? How is technology impacting what you all are doing out in the communities across the U.S.?
Got it. So first of all, we have a vast technological rethink project going on now where we're committed years and millions of dollars to thinking about how we upgrade our systems and data. And so I want to start with an analogy, and then I'll talk about how we're applying it.
Perfect.
So the amazing, to me, the model for everything is nature. And nature uses DNA as its basic data system, but what nature actually does has an incredible ability to heal. So imagine if there's a forest fire. Nature knows exactly the small plants and the medium-sized plants and the big plants, and it knows how to grow back a whole ecosystem and what phases to do that. And the way we build cities, we don't know how to heal. So the question is, and since we're primarily working in low-income parts of cities and with low-income residents, our question is how can we use data to turn our static, dumb ways that we run cities and buildings and people and systems now to make them dynamic and responsive and reactive and ultimately co-evolving.
Great. What about you, Craig? The work that you all are doing with Sidewalk's Lab?
So as a tiny bit of background, Sidewalk Labs was formed with the express idea of taking advantage of technology in cities and figuring out how we might take a big leap in terms of technology that cities aren't maybe taking a complete advantage of. So one example of a technology that we think, this is slightly future looking, will have a big impact and come to, as no surprise to you, is self-driving vehicles. Not just from the way they'll help people get around, but actually even more so as their impact on how urban planning gets done. So just if you think about self-driving cars, reducing or probably eliminating the need for parking, right? Because they'll drop people off and pick them up. And if they need to recharge, they can go up to somewhere where the people aren't. What do we do with that space? Either in existing cities that's now kind of along the sides of all our streets and in our parking lots, how can we use that space better for people? And if we're designing a place from scratch, how wide should the streets be? How should space be allocated that might have previously been diverted to vehicles? And so I think that has a number of really far-reaching consequences beyond just mobility.
It is this whole idea of being able to reclaim a bit of the public space, right? I mean, that in my mind is one of the exciting things about, exciting things about autonomous vehicles is that for such a long time, we've lost a big piece of the public realm, and we're going to essentially be able to hopefully claim some of that space back, right? So as we think about what you guys are doing in Toronto, particularly maybe talk a little bit maybe about, as you think about the design of the space in Toronto and of the project in Toronto, what sort of other, beyond autonomous vehicles, do you see technology playing a role to improve living standards? Maybe, from an environmental standpoint, even from just a, traditional quality of place standpoint.
Absolutely, yeah. So just as a tiny bit of background, Sidewalk Labs is really focused on building a brand new place from scratch in Toronto, right on the waterfront. It used to be the port area of Toronto. Over some amount of time, and we're still in the planning process and going through getting permission from the city and the province of Ontario and the federal government of Canada to go ahead and do that. But our hopes for that area, which is really undeveloped right now, so it's almost tabula rasa, is to think about, as you mentioned, sustainability, sort of environmental things. How can we make this place climate positive? So not just reduce the use of carbon, but reduce it to below zero through clever applications of technology to make heating and cooling more efficient, to non-digital technologies like district heating and cooling, which is often used on some campuses, but expand that to a whole neighborhood. We think about mobility, which I already mentioned. There's a whole bunch of really interesting things, even beyond self-driving vehicles there. When we think about buildings themselves, there are lots of technologies that will enable, and some already exist in some form, as to make buildings much more flexible, so able to adapt to different uses over time, but also cheaper to build at the same or higher quality than we have existing buildings. So buildings themselves, and as you referenced, the quality of the public realm. Each of these things contributes to quality of life in the city, and those are our goals. But in particular in the public realm, if you think about it not just as parks, but once you think about sidewalks and streets, and maybe start erasing the boundaries between sidewalks and streets, and say these places are for people, how do we make them much more usable for a whole bunch of different activities beyond what people use them for now, and really almost create a public realm that's an extension of your living room to make the whole place much more livable. We think about also ways of supporting more community and health and human services. And then sort of underlying all of that, how do we actually build the digital technology that ties this all together? There are opportunities there to create less siloed systems than currently exist within cities.
So what I'm hearing is this idea about how we use technology to really push the envelope on sort of people-centric design, right? Designers and urban developers and people in our space have been thinking about this a long time, but have been constrained by this. But one of the things with technology pushing the boundaries a little bit, we're maybe able to push the envelope, so to speak, on this a little bit more, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are many things that mean the cities move more slowly than technology does. One of those is, for example, cities have the responsibility to take out the trash, on a regular basis, and if that stops, that's a significant problem. And so cities are unwilling to take big risks on technologies. At Google and elsewhere, we build little prototypes, we throw them out there, we say this is in beta. If it works, great, we'll do more of it. If it doesn't work, we'll shut it down. Cities don't have that luxury, and so we hope that by creating a place where we can actually experiment with some of these technologies and prove that some of them do work, then other cities, it turns out that once cities see another city doing something successfully, they're much more likely to follow along. There might be some sort of leading cities that'll try it initially, and once there are a few, then the wave happens. And so our hope is to kind of bootstrap that.
I love that idea of replication, right? This idea that you can take ideas and sort of take it and put it in other cities. And that's why the project, which you all are doing in Toronto, I think is really important. So, Jonathan, I want to go back to what you originally said about this idea of thinking about cities as organisms,
right,
and particularly why data is so important to us. So tell us a little bit more about how you sort of see data and sensing and scenario planning playing a role to make us a much more dynamic planning system, maybe to make things more efficient.
So we plan in a 19th century way, essentially, maybe early 20th century, and then kind of, I feel, distorted by, in 1970 we passed something called NEPA, and we have an environmental impact statement process which just screws everything up as far as I'm concerned. And I'm a deep environmentalist. So, and the reason is we can't dynamically respond to anything. So here's what I recommend, is that number one, cities set visions and goals for what they want to become. And you can turn those into what are called community health indicators. And community health indicators are hundreds of measurements. You can measure things like vehicle miles traveled and amount of walkability, amount of affordability, your climate impacts, and how well kids are doing in school, and suicide rates and arrest rates and all kinds. You have thousands of measurements that measure your vision of what community health is. Governments have tools, and the tools are basically regulations such as zoning codes and building codes and things like that, incentives and tax breaks and things they can do to encourage people to do things, and regulations discourage people from doing bad things, and they make investments in things like infrastructure. They can use those cool tools, I believe, in a continually dynamic process. So I'll give you an example. We have a subway station, and we say we want higher density, mixed use, mixed income, because we want people to be able to walk to it. And today we would come up with some zoning, all these experts would figure out what it should be, and then they'd fix it, and it'd be there for 20 years. And I suggest instead that it be dynamic. Now with sensing, we can, with big data and direct sensing and all that, we can actually see, the first building happens and you see what it does and you keep adjusting. And so, for example, you create more, let's say it doesn't look like it's affordable enough, so you create more incentives for affordability. And let's say it's not, you don't feel like people are walking enough, and you can make higher uses of retail uses that encourage people to stay in the area. There's a million tools that we have, but we can be, so we're dynamically, continually evolving towards our vision. We have no capacity to do that right now.
Yeah, because all of the data that we use in this process is always looking backwards, right? I mean, for the most part, we look backwards. What happened over time, and not really looking to the future. I mean, we try to do that as folks in the data space, but we don't do a very good job of it.
So there's a new program developed by an architect named Peter Calthorpe. He's my brother-in-law, I got to reveal that, called Urban Footprint. But what Urban Footprint is a future casting system. And so it's a scenario planning system. So what I think you need to be doing is not only collecting this real-time data, but at the same time, always scenario future casting forward. You'll never be 100% right, But the future casting, the scenario plan will give you a sense of where to go, and it'll give you a sense of the implications. And with artificial intelligence, in essence, you can use your scenario planning and your real-time data collection and keep fine-tuning yourself towards outcomes. And just recognize it'll never be perfect. It's always evolving, and it's dynamic.
So Elizabeth, let's talk about inclusion and talk about this idea of protection of local character. As many of you know, as we talk about the rise of technology in cities, particularly cities like our hometown of New York, the question of inclusion and displacement and really trying to maintain neighborhood identity and authenticity. With technology coming, and fastly coming even more so in the urban space. It's interesting that we've been a slow adopter in the urban space to see technology. But as it comes, how do we maintain the balance? How do we make sure that we're sort of protecting, that local character and being inclusive? How do we do that?
Right. Well, I think, this is a huge challenge. And I want to reiterate something that you said, Jonathan, around the environmental process, because the environmental process in New York City is one of the mechanisms that the public is allowed to touch big planning projects. And it is, I couldn't agree with you more about how deeply flawed it is. Among other things, we don't learn from that process. Right. So we gather all this data that the public has interacted with in the course of one planning project or another, or a particular project that's coming forward in a community. And yet we don't ever learn whether that environmental document was effective at establishing mitigations that actually worked. So, humans fundamentally don't like change. We all, and I'm sure all of you who live in New York or wherever you live around the world, you moved into a neighborhood, you kind of had a sense of what that was going to be like. You chose it deliberately, hopefully. You had the privilege of being able to do that. And, the idea that we could continually change that without understanding what it is probably going to freak out most New Yorkers and citizens. So the question is, how do you create that level of engagement that data actually means something to the citizenry? So in New York City, we collect a ton of data. And I'm sure everyone in this room understands the concept of a government, Gov 2.0, and the fact that government is not always the best provider of data back to the public in a way that they can understand it. So one of the things that we need to do, and really in a very global way, and my organization is confronting this every day, because we're trying to figure out, well, where is growth likely to happen in New York? Where does preservation efforts need to be out in front? All those kinds of things. It's really hard to figure that out. And if you're an average citizen looking at the data that's collected in New York, it's very hard to get a handle on what you're looking at. So this interface between the collection of data and the purveying of that data so that communities can actually engage in it is a really, really, really important thing. And it involves capacity building in the community, and this is a very human engagement. It's not really about technology, it's really about getting out there and helping communities understand what tools they can reach for and how they can educate themselves about how the system works, how they can engage that system, where are the pressure points that they can engage with, and encouraging them to do that and making sure that at a governmental level, the playing field is as level as it can. So whether you come from a poor community or a rich community, is your voice heard equally in the process? We all probably know what the answer to that question is, but that's probably for later in the discussion.
So when we think about urban planning, one of the biggest things that we use to sort of dictate the way that we obviously use land is our zoning codes, right? There's some land that's in zone for industrial use, some that's zoned for commercial use, and some that is zoned for residential. And generally speaking, cities like to separate uses, right? We like to separate uses because, frankly, we like to keep things nice and tidy a little bit, right? That's sort of the ideas.
Well,
of
we
this.
did it for health.
We did it. That's right.
In the first place.
So that said, one of the questions that I have for you all as we think about technology, and this is a bit of a geeky question, but it is, how is the role of technology going to allow us to really think about how we rethink zoning in our cities and our communities? Craig, you're probably thinking about this really specifically in Toronto. Some thoughts on that?
One of the specific things we're thinking about is outcome-based codes. So to your point, zoning and building codes tend to be fairly prescriptive and static and say, we know that in New York City, cast iron pipes for plumbing work really well and are really safe. So that's everybody has to do that. Of course, as technology improves, there are probably a bunch of other solutions that maybe achieve the same goals at lower cost or more flexibility and so on. But because they're sort of not on the list of approved construction materials, et cetera, they're not an option. Now with sensors, and to your point, Jonathan, we can start saying potentially, let's monitor, let's think about it, maybe an example of noise, and one of the issues around kind of having light industrial next to residential is maybe you're going to disturb people with noise. Let's say that you can use the space for whatever you like, as long as the noise level, as monitored by some sensor that doesn't record people talking, but just the sound pressure level, as long as it doesn't go above a certain amount. And so you have to provide a building and a set of uses that dampens the sound and so on, and that's monitored on a dynamic, active basis. Rather than saying there's just a set of ways you have to build a building because we know that goes above and beyond the standard. And that's true about all kinds of things, around odor, around activities, and so on. So can you actually define building codes based on the outcomes you want to achieve, and then allow innovation to provide new sort of clever ways of achieving those outcomes, and be less prescriptive about the way that the codes are written.
And Jonathan, that's where that dynamic data plays an
Right.
important role to allow you to think about those outcome metrics. True?
Exactly. So the other thing is that our culture has changed enormously. If you think about it, when America was founded, I believe 90% of people lived on farms, where, by the way, they were living, working, manufacturing, in effect, doing everything all in one place. And then we became more segmented, and industrialization was a very dirty process, and you didn't want to live near it. It was to protect people. But today, if you think about how most of us live and work, it's in a very integrative way. And although you may want to separate significant heavy-duty manufacturing out, the way people naturally want to live now is in a much more integrated way, and we need communities that will reflect that.
So this week, there have been 3 articles alone about the rise of modular construction, right? Modular housing construction, as a sort of technology in the development space. Thoughts on that? Do you see that as an innovative technology or a trend that will change how we sort of think about affordability or even the construction space as we develop cities for the future?
Yes. So I'm going to go near term, far term.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so in the near term, we've thought about manufactured housing as creating chunks, basically boxes that you add up. And there's some advantage to that, but there's some also inflexibility. But there's a company now, for example, named DIRTT, which is based in Canada, which has a DIRTT. This is not an advertisement for them, but they have a system in which you do 3D design of the space that you want. You put on goggles and you can actually walk and see through the space. It's in real time giving you back the pricing information. You're picking finishes, you're doing all kinds of stuff. And then when you want to order, you push order. And then the factory builds it exactly as it is, and it gets delivered to you, and they have installation teams. So you're really integrating design, pricing, and delivery. And it's much more, by the way, material efficient, which is environmentally efficient. Okay, but that's still at so those are walls and pieces, so those are less than the chunk level. But where I really want to go is, remember I started with the analogy of DNA.
Yes.
So from an environmental point of view, we have to move from, we currently build out of concrete, steel, glass, copper, and all these we mine from the earth and all have very negative environmental impacts. The true solution, at least in the next 100 or 200 years, to the environmental issues, we have to start building out of timber and organic materials, because timber captures carbon, has much lower embodied energy, and it's a regenerative material. And for example, we can already begin to grow fungus-like, kind of mushroom-like insulations. So the issue is we have to move from mining in organic materials to turning to biological buildings. We have to start growing our building materials. So to me, the future step is where we're designing our buildings in 3D, and then we're turning that not into plans, but we're turning that into DNA. And we're actually growing the components that we need, high-tech components for our buildings. And then when it's time to recycle them or disassemble them, you can, because they have a basic code that we have created, we can decode them and repurpose them. And that's really, so it's following nature's cycle as to how we're going to solve our environmental issues and create much more affordable buildings.
So let's just recap some of the things that we've heard so far about technology. We've heard that, number one, technology, the rise of technology in the urban space is going to give us more back in the public realm back, perhaps. It's going to make us more climate sensitive, really thinking about how we think about the environment going in the future. Maybe more affordable housing, may help with the inclusion piece. One last thing we haven't touched on enough is this engagement piece, Elizabeth, which I know that you wrote a terrific piece about how government is disconnected a bit from the citizenry. How do you see us using technology, particularly how can government use technology to really engage with its community base in a much more really authentic way, perhaps?
Yeah, so I'm just going to tell a little bit of a personal story, which is that when I was in government in San Francisco, I often would hear from my employees who had seen me on the cable channel testifying before the Board of Supervisors about the budget or some policy issue that was before the Recreation Park Department, which is the one I was running at the time. And I recently went down to a BSA hearing, the Board of Standards and Appeals in New York City. And not only is there no closed circuit TV, so that if you can't get in the room, you absolutely do not know what's going on in that room unless someone comes out with a bullhorn and tells you in the outer room what's going on. There's no computer screen that even says what items the commission is on. I mean, literally, we are in, what is that, 1980s technology in terms of public engagement. It also means that if you are a citizen who radical new idea works, you can't get to those hearings and can't engage in the democratic process in any substantive way. You have to take time off, you have to get a babysitter, you have to show up in a room where you may or may not ever be able to interact with the policymakers who are making decisions. That is, we are very, very far away from the ideal, let's just say. But let me just talk about a couple of ways in which technology actually changes very fundamentally. So technology, voting machines' ability to do rank order voting, for instance, is the difference between us having a locked-in two-party system and the possibility of more minority views, and I don't mean diversity views, but just any kind of minority view, beginning to percolate up in our political system. So there is, and that's, voting is the thing that New Yorkers are not doing today that they should be. And so we need to figure out how that happens. This is the most fundamental way in which we engage with our government. But when you move into these much more complicated city planning and land use decisions that are being made and talked about, I mean, I've been following the Toronto project, and the initial level of suspicion about what your very thoughtful planning process was really going to be about is kind of understandable, because we live in a world where there's a lot of distrust between government and citizens. And part of it is this sense that decisions are being made behind closed doors. So the question is how you open those doors, and how do you create a level playing field so people can engage in the dialogue. There's a lot of technology tools to do that. People are using, the ability for people, for instance, just to interact on a website or whatever, to put in their opinions and views on a particular policy decision that's being made. But there's also opportunities in the local community to really think about how do we allow policymakers to engage on a much more incremental level with their own constituents. And I don't think that's what we're doing. I mean, tweeting is not a substitute for real political dialogue. I don't think anyone in the room would doubt that, and certainly in the last year and a half, am I counting right? We've seen how that's just a destructive force in a democratic dialogue rather than a constructive one.
So really giving folks a mechanism for having a true voice at the table, so to speak. So Armand, you said we've got some questions about transportation.
Yes, everyone's very excited about the futuristic of cities, but tell me about my commute.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm hearing like ride-sharing services have helped, bike-sharing services, like we have a few docks outside. In California, in our offices there's now dockless scooters. So how are we going to get around cities? How will that be changing? And mixed-use zoning helps in regards to the commute, which we all talked about. But what else is in store?
Well, can I speak a little bit to where we are in New York City at the moment? Because I think this is a really interesting question about technology. So we are an environmentally strong city because we use mass transit. And our carbon footprint is much lower because we do. Yet we have a subway system which is in a state of, depending on which day it is, one might say total collapse or partial collapse. We have a brilliant new leader who actually came from Andy Byford, who came from Toronto, actually, who I was very pessimistic about this, and he's been really causing my optimism to rise. He is deliberately picking a tool for fixing our subway system that is not the most cutting edge of technology. And it's very much to this point you made a little bit earlier about, does government want to risk being on the absolute front edge, which many of you know Governor Cuomo has been making an argument that we ought to try a new technology in our subway system. And Andy Byford, to his enormous credit, is saying, not until it's proven, because I have to deliver this fast and well, and I'm going to use a technology that's been effective in other cities, right? Much better than the technology which is now almost 100 years old in our subway system, but nonetheless not at the cutting edge. And that gets to this dynamic about whether governments can really truly adopt the most cutting edge tool, I think. We want him to actually make our subway system work better in the next 5 years, which he says he is able to do. If that's a trade-off against a dream of a technology that might take us a little bit further, I don't know. That's a hard trade-off to make. I think I want my E-train to run faster sooner.
More thoughts on sort of the future of technology and transportation as we look to the future for cities, both from planning and maybe even towards implementation? Jonathan? Or?
So the dream of autonomous vehicles has an economics to it, which we don't discuss much, and that is utilization. Right. So the car that's 24-hour utilized. So by the way, I've said to several autonomous vehicle makers, and they've all ignored me, that if I were going to roll out a system, the number one place I do it is in Las Vegas in the Sunset Strip, because the weather's great and the utilization is 24 hours, and it's a very small range. You got to map it all. It's a very small range. I would think that would be like the most profitable street in the world to do. But anyway. But something. So
maybe the mayor's listening, hopefully, right?
Yeah, but at any rate, the point is all about utilization. So when you guys are too young to remember, but when cable TV first got rolled out, all the cable TV companies said to cities, it's too expensive to go everywhere. We are just going to start, we want a franchise, we just want to start in the places that's most profitable. And then over decades, literally, they were ultimately forced to do universal service, which they don't really, but anyway, try and get Fios out in the Bronx or something, but anyway, which they theoretically, have risen to. So I see this as the issue. That the autonomous vehicle companies are going to say, we want to be where it's most profitable. Right. And so you're going to be either you're on the loop or you're in the system, you're outside of the system. And rural America and there's going to be whole parts of places in which there's, in essence, the system is going to be biased against because of profitable utilization. Mm-hmm. And so if you really want an equitable system, the subway system is a really equitable system. So I think in putting on a government hat, with franchise agreements, you have to franchise with a bias towards equitability.
So are you suggesting that we have to sort of think about the role of technology, the future of transportation, even more as a public good? Continue to sort of think about it as a public good, even as we sort of mix and match the delivery vehicle?
So you have to think about it as a public good, and you have to think about, just as a founding premise another founding premise of all my thinking, America is hugely zip code biased. So if you live in the healthiest zip code, you are 20 years statistically, you're likely to live 20 years longer than the least healthy zip code. Sure. And if you grew up in the best public school district or one of the top 20 public school districts, your chance of getting into college is literally 100 times greater than if you grew up in the worst, maybe even more than 100 times greater. So we have these enormous zip code biases, and my theory about public policy is to always overcome those biases and equally distribute the landscape of opportunity. So, and transportation, which is the connectivity system, is one of those prime functions. I basically say information, healthcare, education, and transportation are the places where you want the ground of equality to begin.
And Craig wanted to.
Well, I was going to say on the mobility side. First, I think I've been sort of making the assumption, and I think the panel has in general, that self-driving cars are coming. I just want to double check that with the audience. This is probably a slightly biased audience, but who thinks in 20 years there'll be lots of self-driving cars sort of everywhere? Okay, fine. So you guys are mostly bought in, which is kind of what I suspected. One of I think the impacts of self-driving vehicles, other than kind of the mobility we already talked about and the urban planning, is safety. And because these are computing devices that are looking in all directions at once, have lots of redundancy. So the team at Waymo, for example, which is spun off from Google, is got working on very, very safe redundant computing, paying attention all of the time, which is something that human drivers just don't have the capacity to do, right? And often choose not to do actively. And so one impact of that is that we have the opportunity to give streets much more back to pedestrians and cyclists, like actual people sort of wandering around under their own steam. And so I think one of the other implications of self-driving vehicles is, in fact, more walking, more cycling, more healthy ways of getting around. Another couple of implications are, right now we have a vehicle fleet where somebody buys a car for themselves, sometimes when they're commuting on their own, and then on the weekends they have the whole family, and so they buy sort of a larger vehicle than they need most of the time. You would imagine a fleet of autonomous vehicles might come in a whole bunch of sizes. In fact, most of them will be relatively small because they'll be for individuals, which will also make things safer because it's sort of less mass moving around, but also less congested because there are sort of smaller vehicles. But there are some challenges, I think. This is not an allied good. You can imagine if it's super comfortable to be in your autonomous vehicle commuting, and you can read the paper, you can watch a movie, you can catch a nap, people might be happy just sort of being in congested traffic a lot and kind of just getting other stuff done, and we might end up with cities completely choked by vehicles. And it's not clear that will happen, but it seems like a high enough likelihood that we need to think about the kinds of policies and regulations around these, and maybe the kinds of market forces that would not create that dystopian future. And so I think there's some really interesting challenges ahead that aren't just technological challenges, but also, like I said, sort of policy and regulation challenges.
So, Craig, you hit on a really important point, and that is public policy needs to be thinking about these challenges now. Elizabeth, you had something that you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, no, I was going to talk a little bit about this dystopic view that you began with. I mean, Americans tend to think about our cars as our personal thing. Right. Even in New York, and even with car sharing, we think about these as our personal thing. And if autonomous vehicles are actually going to achieve a utopian vision and not a dystopic vision, we need to let go of that idea, right? Because it can't be 1 for 1 or even 1 for 4. We just don't have the room for it. And if we're going to garner back the street and the sidewalk for the public, we need not to have people believe that their autonomous car is going to be sitting outside their apartment building waiting for them whenever they want to go, right? And that's exactly the public policy challenge that we have to confront, is against our other side, which is selfish and wants the maximum convenience we can get. And so those two things have to be balanced by public policy. And can they be balanced by public policy fast enough that the use of autonomous cars hasn't set into a pattern that we then have to break? And that's I think the challenge of the timing. How do we think through the public policy issues soon enough that we're actually implementing them along with autonomous cars, as opposed to after autonomous cars have begun to set patterns?
Because that's an important point. Public policy always tends to be reactive instead of proactive, or moving or changing, which I think gets to the point of why we need data. Let's just shift the conversation just a bit. I want to talk about data privacy and why we collect data. So, Craig, you all with Sidewalk Labs may be thinking about how you're going to look at data of your residents and the businesses that are in your district. What types of data do you think are you going to be collecting, and how are you going to think about privacy as you mitigate these?
Yeah, this is an issue that lots of people are concerned
about. This is
the
issue of when we talk about the planning in Toronto a little bit. Yeah.
So the way we think about it is we always start at Sidewalk Labs with the quality of life goals that we have, and I kind of listed things like mobility and sustainability and public realm and buildings and so on as kind of some of the things we want to improve on in terms of public life. And that's where we start when we think about data, at least we don't think about data until we've identified that we need data to achieve certain goals. So, for example, if you work through goals around sustainability, around air quality and water quality and energy usage for heating and cooling, it turns out that the list of kinds of data that you need, like the flow of water through pipes, the flow of sewage through pipes, the amount of energy consumed by a building, the amount of heating and cooling district-wide, and so on, these don't seem like things that have privacy implications. And in fact, when you go down the list of these quality of life goals, it's not really clear to me where privacy invasive data plays a role. There will be other systems somewhere else. Obviously we all use devices that in some ways, ask for and gather our private data. But it's not at all clear to me that the city and the public realm should be gathering personally identifiable data. It seems to me that we can achieve most of the big leaps without doing that. And furthermore, I think there are ways that technology can improve people's privacy. So at the moment, it's a bit of a silly example, but if I go to a bar and I want to buy a drink, not me personally, I was about to say, the bartender wants to check that I'm of drinking age, I'm fine. But if somebody does ask for my driver's license, I hand over to them my name, my address, my actual exact date of birth. And there are technologies based on cryptographic signatures, essentially proofs of claims, that allow me to demonstrate to the bartender that I'm of drinking age as certified by the DMV or some other organization, that they can verify in a technological way that don't reveal any data apart from the fact that I'm over 21. And that's maybe a slightly contrived example, but there are many of these cases where, in fact, we think in cities, you should be able to reveal much less about yourself as you're going about your daily life than you currently are required to.
So, Jonathan, you've given a lot of thought to how data should play a role in planning and development. What about the privacy issue from your perspective?
So it's a little more complicated because one of the things we're really focusing on now, and we have this big partnership we put together with the Harvard School of Public Health, Columbia School of Public Health, Dartmouth, and others to try and do a baseline assessment of our residents and see if certain interventions we're doing on health and education actually make a difference. And you can do that on a population level, and you can do it by measuring things like hospital emergency room, ambulances visiting your property and stuff like that. But what I really want to know is cortisol levels and what I, for measuring stress. Yes. And what I really, there's this stuff, I really want to know, am I individual, how many people's diabetes have we reduced? Insulin levels are improved or whatever. That's complicated. So I'll tell you, the most interesting technology we've come across, we are not using this yet, but we've just discovered this, is there's a guy who measures basically human waste. He goes to city sewer systems and he measures the level of cortisol in it. There are a bunch of metabolites that show how well you're digesting what you've been eating and show whether you've been exposed to environmental toxins, et cetera. And that's a way we think to be, so we need to find, if not that system, some system where we can actually get human health, real data, but in an anonymous way.
Got to be a cleaner way to do it, maybe, right?
Talk about cleaning your
hygiene,
data.
Right? Yeah, for sure. Elizabeth, should the community be concerned about privacy as we think about data? What's your thought from the?
Well, I think the answer is, of course. Yeah. And the issues that we've just talked about, both of Jonathan and Craig have just talked about, are examples of how it can work in our favor. But without thinking proactively about that, it doesn't have to come out that way, right? And we need to find ways to not only create data that is anonymized, but useful for these bigger societal goals, but we also need to create data that is accessible to the public so that they know what everyone else is seeing. Because part of the issue here is transparency, right? Is that it doesn't feel good if somebody else is collecting a bunch of data about my community and I don't get to see it and I don't understand what the implications of it are. Whereas if we can begin to think about, as we go along, how do we make that data, which will be largely innocuous, right? Transparent so that people understand where it is innocuous and where it isn't. And then able to intervene, I think is a really interesting dynamic that we need to think about. But I also just want to point out that a lot of the data that we're collecting now isn't useful to government or the private sector or to individuals at all. You know, we sort of collect it, but we're at that stage when we don't know quite what to do with it yet, and how to analyze it, and how to make it useful. And I think that you know, we met with a city council person not too long ago, and he said, well, you know, there's this phenomenon going on in my neighborhood, and everybody tells us it's only in our neighborhood of these illegal conversions of housing units. And we went to the public sector data that afternoon, pulled a big map of complaints that are coming in all across the city, and guess what? It's not just happening in his district, it's happening all across the city. And part of that is just the very simple learning how to express that data in a way that it's useful to policymakers.
So before we came out, Jonathan, you posed a really interesting question and about this idea about enhancing data to make us, is enhancing data making us better consumers or better citizens? Yes. Talk a little bit more about that and your thoughts on that question.
So, as you know, my sense is the use of data by all of the for-profits and companies such as Google's and many, many others is all being used for income optimization of the company. And that essentially looks at individuals as consumers and asks, what can I either sell them or facilitate the sales to them, and where's their money to be made in that? And that's the function of the data. And what's happened in America, and actually I'm seeing globally, is that people are thinking much less about their roles as citizens. You mentioned the roles as even voting, and there's a really depressing article in the New York Times this weekend about a guy trying to do voter registration at Randall's Island at a music festival. And I hope everybody in this audience is registered, and if you're not registered to vote, please register to vote and tell your friends to register. It's hugely important. And we are beginning to get the kinds of governments that happen when we don't care, or we don't care enough. Citizen engagement, so there's a measure of how you know what a really healthy community is, and it turns out it's called collective efficacy. It is whether people in that community feel that acting together they can make a difference, and then experience the actual making of a difference. And that, by the way, can be very data enabled. We can use it to gather people together, create movements, to create information, areas of interest. It's very different than turning people into consumers.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, well, I also think there are big problems that take big data and big policy results. So we were talking a little bit before about climate change, and I've been very concerned about Heat Island in particular, because I think most of the tools that are being used at the governmental level, certainly here in New York, are very low tech. They're white paint and trees. Love trees. White paint is fine, but it's not exactly a high-tech solution. Whereas if we were beginning to model the natural wind patterns of New York and zoning, creating zoning and policy implications for maximizing that, we wouldn't be doing just the thing. You know, Heat Island means that we pump our air conditioning and our cooling and all those systems up, which of course makes the problem worse. So in that case, we've got a relatively old school technology that's actually exacerbating a problem rather than making it better. Whereas if we had combinations of scientists and planners working together with data to really think about, well, what are the changes we need to make in New York City to really take advantage of our natural systems to cool the city in a better way, we might actually be preventing people from dying every summer, which is what happens in New York.
Armand, you had a question from the audience?
Greg, feel free to
I'll just quickly weigh in on community engagement. I think one opportunity is we talk about all politics being local, but how about hyperlocal? If I want to have a block party and shut down my block, on the weekend and invite, have some folks along and play some music, there's a big permitting process. The NYPD, it's complicated and it sort of doesn't happen very often. What if it were possible for me to say, I live in this neighborhood, who around me is sort of thumbs up, thumbs down about having a block party? If things turn out, if people like the idea, then maybe there's an automated process for that permit to be granted, as long as there's no, extenuating circumstances. And you make it much easier for those things to happen, and start by having like a tiny bit of sort of low risk democracy happening at a hyper local level, and sort of build up from there, because sort of the stakes are lower. more, and things can happen a little bit more quickly, and things there's more maybe instant gratification there. I think there might be some opportunities to start there and grow that into something more impactful.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I like that idea. My neighbors will always say no, perhaps. Question from the audience.
Yeah, so similar to that, Jason has asked, outcome-based zoning rules. At what granularities do you plan to try this? One could envision a mixed-use building where multiple tenants have to collectively share a limit on noise, odor, et cetera. Do you expect to see new cap and trade economies evolve within and or across properties?
I think there's lots of interesting open questions with the idea of outcome-based codes. So I think we need to start by demonstrating that the data can be collected, and then I think, yeah, there probably is some experimentation about like what does it mean. There are certain things that are life safety. Those are kind of non-negotiable. Those can't be sort of negotiated within a building. There are other things that are around comfort and maybe are negotiated within a building. But I think it's a new enough idea that there's probably a number of iterations to go through in a sort of a safe environment before I think we understand exactly what those should look like. And of course, it's in the end, it's a city regulation question. And so the city has to be convinced, and that's a pretty high bar, that this is a better solution than the current fixed outcome.
Well, they also have to be able to respond to that data, right? I mean, it's not just a question of the public's willingness to engage in that data and have it dictate a way, an approach in a particular place, but it's also the city's ability to understand all that incrementality and how it comes together, and to be able to regulate it in a way that's responsive to that. And when you look at some of our city agencies, one doesn't really think that's going to happen tomorrow.
I just want to add, go Jason, that idea of a cap and trade economy at the building level is a fantastic idea. It could be an amazing marketplace for environmental good.
One question before we wrap, kind of a question from Philip. I think everyone's going to be excited to hear this. The panel talked about getting people to think as citizens and get involved. Could there be a 20% like project for citizens to get involved? What would that look like? How could they do that?
It's a great question.
For the technologists in the room, head down to Civic Hall. There's a great organization here in New York City where there's a physical gathering of people thinking about these problems and get involved in a project.
We are actually trying to do an initiative to get 1 million low-income voters registered. I go back to voter registration, but once we get them registered, we need to inform them about issues, and it'd be great to do a 20% project that figures out how you really inform people about issues.
So one of the things I hear, hearing, just wrapping up the conversation a bit, is that if we're thinking about the role of technology and the impact on the future, it's going to involve engagement. It's engagement from the technology side, it's engagement from the development side, but also engagement from the community, right? That it can't just be top down, that this idea that we have to look to provide mechanisms for the community to engage as well is a critically important piece to this as well. Please join me in thanking our panelists. We are at time.
And thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you.